Well, welcome back into the Norfolk Cottage Garden here in mid-Norfolk, and this evening we are going to be showing you how to prune these established climbing roses that have been growing here on the end of the house for the youngest one's probably around 1 or 2 years old. That's the Albertine on the left, which is the tall, straggly growing rose, and the one on the right has been in situ probably for around 60 years. It's a really well established old climber, this. If I show you the thickness of the stem where it's been cut back to, as we've undertaken serial repair work on the end of this house with work to the renders and the trellis work, it's had really quite a series of hard prunes. But you'll see this year the growth's really getting away nicely now. This gable end was painted 2 years ago now, and this rose was cut back to a very minimal framework, and the flowering volume that was subsequently had the following year was really diminished in terms of what we would normally expect of that. But what we're going to do this evening is to start training this Albertine further up this trellis work. It's just about now grown so that we can get these long laterals which are arching their way down onto that top frame that makes its way across the door lintel. And we're also going to extend it around the side where the trellis extends slightly up there. You'll see that on the top we've also got a mixed planting. That's a honeysuckle that's right up the top, and lower down there are other roses. If you're anything like us, you will use this opportunity to plant multiple roses. So in this planting there are actually 4 rose trees or climbers. Now the reason we've done that is there's an opportunity with climbers. Some are very vigorous growers and will extend up 15-20 feet. Albertine's certainly one of those, and the more established older rose on the right is also a very vigorous grower. As you can see, those long arching stems growing out of the top of the rose by probably about 8 to 10 feet per year. And then there are much less vigorous growers, shorter climbing roses if you like, ones that only make it up to 6 or 8 feet, and by underplanting your more vigorous specimens with these less vigorous ones, you can effectively get the flowers right the way down almost to the ground, then with that secondary flush, and you get the variety of roses all in one place, and you can extend your flowering season nicely. Now, with any rose, when it comes to pruning, you can break it down into 3 simple elements. First being the removal of any damaged or diseased growth. Things like this on this lower rose. You can see this is dying back. We've got dead bits. That's all going to be cut out first, and that's simple. Doesn't matter what type of rose you're dealing with. The first element of your prune is to remove all those dead, dying and diseased pieces of rose bush. Now, not every rose is going to put a new stem up from the base every year. Some will only do it a couple of times in their lifetime. And if they don't, then that doesn't matter. The variety might live for years and years and years on these older established growths. And as long as you've got a good framework that is giving you a good display of flower up above, then you may find, as with this one, all your growth is coming out of the top. And that brings us to stage 3 of your decisions when you're pruning these roses. Where you've got an established framework on a trellis or support, you've got to be realistic about how much weight of rose that support can take. If you overdo it and try and retain too much of the new vigorous growth, then chances are your framework's going to fail. And when that happens, as happened to us earlier this year with the Ethel rose round in the vegetable garden here, you're left with no other options other than to do a really heavy prune back, re-put in your stakes or supports or framework, and really start almost from scratch again. You probably won't get much in the way of flower in the subsequent season, but this season after that the growth should have come back and you'll be back where you started. However, we want to try and avoid that. So what we're doing here is looking at how much of this growth we can sensibly retain and tie in, and you're looking for opportunities here. I'm looking at that long arching stem that's coming all the way down in front of the door and thinking that is going to tie beautifully in to that top framework and run along parallel with the rose coming from the right. I'm also looking at some of these other stems here to try and fan them out and extend the rose that only goes as far as that top framework really at the moment. All that growth up the top, that's all clematis. Sorry, not clematis. That is a honeysuckle. Having a crunchy moment there, really had to think what that was. But what I want to do is get some of these stems tied up and brought right away round onto the side of the house and fan them out so that they're not clumped or sitting too close together. You want to avoid any of these stems rubbing on one another because that's going to create sores and that will allow disease into the rose. So you want to space them and you want to tie them nicely with soft support so you're not damaging this young, not particularly woody growth. And if you can't tie them in because the framework is too full or crowded, then I'm afraid you need to be drastic and you need to remove them. And I know that is reducing the amount of flower that you're going to get on this rose, but realistically you've got to look at the end frame and the design of this rose so that you're getting a good distribution of fresh young stems. If you can bend them so that they're on a horizontal level as opposed to going straight up, they're far more likely to break bud at every leaf joint and give you far more flower in the early stages. So we're going to get a ladder out and we're going to proceed with pruning this, and I'll show you us taking first the dead wood out, then we'll look for those new growths, and then we'll start tying back a lot of this growth into the framework and seeing what we end up with. Just before we start, the equipment you're going to need for this job: a nice lightweight adjustable ladder, something that you can alter the height on and is going to give you a stable platform. A nice twine, it can be string as I've got here, or plastic coated wire, anything that's soft and not going to damage the rose stem. You're going to need a good pair of gloves and a sharp pair of snips, and a matching pair of Weimaranas will always give you a hand. But actually up that ladder I don't think they're going to be too much good for me. But come on, let's get started. Enough of the theory now. So first thing is to remove any dead or dying or diseased wood. And we're doing that just on this lower rose. You can see this bit's got dieback here to this new growth coming out, so we'll just take it back to that new joint. And anything that's got brown and dyed back, that really needs to come out. This one you can see back to there is coming out, and the bit going up behind it has died out as well, so I'm removing that. And sometimes if it's gone around the trellis you need to do this in parts rather than pulling. And again, this bit here hasn't put much growth on this season, so good idea just to take that top bit out. And again, these growths here that are coming away from the trellis are not going to be easy to tie in. You can take those out to encourage the growth where you do want it, which is flat against the trellis where it can be grown up and either work behind the metal or tied in. So next step, obviously, to look for those new upright main stems which are going to form the framework of your future rose. And this one has come to here last year and then split, and we've got these long lateral growths going off, one nice and upright and another across the front door. What I'm wanting to do is try and retain both of those because they're coming off that main upright, which is going to form a replacement if we get any disease or dieback on the old straight stem. So let's see if we can manage to get one of those more upright and the other to go across the top of this wall. When I'm tying these stems in against the framework, I'm doing so in quite a loose fashion. You'll see the twine here isn't holding the stem quite tight against the frame. It's got some movement in there, but the knot is formed really well, and that will allow this just to move slightly as the wind catches it, and it won't constrict that stem. If you make the tight joint too tight, then you can basically have that cutting into the stem and restricting the growth and flower. So we've tied this in two places now, one there and one there, and now what I'm going to have to do is move the ladder and work it so that it's not constricting or blocking any of these other lateral growths off the rose coming in the opposite direction. I want to try and get this stem right the way across the door so that it extends the Albertine into the pink rose that's coming from the right. Well, here is the halfway point. What we've managed to do is thin that canopy across the top of the doorway, and we've tied in the lateral shoots so they're running almost horizontal. We've had to cut out quite a few of the new growth that's come from a lot of those laterals that are established, just to tidy it up. But what you want to do is just open this canopy up so that you can get that new growth tied in and down. We've also managed to get some of this growth starting to come up through the top part of this trellis work, and now I'm going to try and get this last bit here, which is arching down, and see if I can get that tied in so it goes round laterally. These lower growths that we haven't got space on this trellis to tie into, we're pruning back to around 6 inches. Now that should form a flowering spur next year. That will break where there's buds on it and give us some lower flower lower down this rose. We've also got this other rose coming up, which again we're going to tie in just up this side very edge to try and bring it up, but we're only going to tie that in to around the 4 to 5 foot mark, because this is a much less vigorous rose and will hopefully give us some low flower next season. Well, and here we have the end result, which I'm quite pleased with. We've managed to bring the lateral growth right the way around onto the side of this trellis, and the laterals going the other way across the top of the doorway to meet the other rose coming. We've tidied up the main stem so it's nice and looking very tidy against its trellis. No loose bits to blow around in the wind. It's all tied down nicely. There's very little that's rubbing against any other wood, so there's no opportunity for the rose to be damaged during the winter storms. And the only loose bit we've got now at the top is the honeysuckle, which is still covered in berries, so we're going to leave that and see how it fares, but that will probably have a prune once the berries have disappeared later in the season or next spring. So there we have 2 established climbing roses pruned back to hopefully give us a fantastic show in the coming season next year.